I am totally corrupt. I mean, really, my whole economic success, whatever that is based solely on the existence of segregation, violence, despair, disease, and injustice. And if by some miracle the whole world were suddenly tranquil, pure, I'd be standing on an unemployment line somewhere. So you see, I'm not a moralist. If I were, I'd be donating my salary to those school teachers. Right? I'm a hustler. As long as they give, I'll grab.
Here is a motion picture film. Let's tidy up this tangle of film by putting it on a reel.
And hello, listeners. This is Film Swap, and my name is David Seeley, and this is my esteemed co-host, the one and only ecstatic gaucho himself, a man who's so cool that he knew Leonard Cohen personally. That's how much street cred this man has. Here he is, Mr. Jonathan Pritchard Barrett. Jonathan, how are you doing?
Hi there, David. I'm very well, thank you. Good to be here again.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And we've got a couple of really, really amazing films to talk about tonight.
We do.
Why don't you tell our listeners out there exactly what's going to happen in the next hour or so?
Well, we have two films. One called Reds, which is written and directed by Warren Beatty. It was a passion project for him, and it was released in 1981. And it also stars Diane Keaton and Jack Nicholson, and it's all basically about the life and career of the crusading journalist John Reed, American journalist. And then the other film we have is Lenny, and Lenny came out in 1974. Thank you very much. 1974, and this was directed by Bob Fosse, who's best known for his...
Fosse, I think.
Is it Fosse? Is it? Okay.
I think so, but we probably should have clarified that.
I don't know where you find that out. I don't know where you find that out. Anyway, it's one of Dustin Hoffman's sort of earlier films, I suppose. He's sort of from his more independent phase in the sort of 60s and 70s, the main star is Dustin Hoffman. The other people, I've never heard of them before. And it's all about
the great Valerie Perrin as well. Again, I'm not
Valerie
sure if that's
Perrin,
how you pronounce her name. I'm pretty sure that's how you say it.
Yes, Valerie Perrin is in it, and she is still alive. I'm not sure if she's still working, but she's still with us. And it is like Reds. It's a biopic or biopic, or there's another different pronunciation.
I think it's biopic.
I call it biopic, but some people have a funny different pronunciation of it.
Pronunciation podcast. Welcome.
Yeah, but we'll limit our pronunciation stuff to those two. And it's about Lenny Bruce, the comedian, who was another sort of iconoclast, I guess, or a rebel. And he was sort of, you could say, he invented independent comedy in some ways.
He did. Yes, he was quite a central figure of the kind of counterculture of the late 60s and 70s, wasn't he? Yeah,
well, sort of 50s and 60s, because he died in 1966.
Yes.
But he was, a key figure, and really, if he'd lived a little bit longer, everybody would know his name.
Absolutely. Well, that's a couple of great films. And so our theme is real rebels tonight, because both of the central characters...
They're rebels.
They were rebels, indeed. Hence the title. Yeah. But anyway, what we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen, is we are going to take an incredibly tiny break of mere seconds. So please don't go away. Keep your ears peeled, because we are going to be literally right back. And then we're going to talk about our first film, Warren Beatty's grand historical epic, Reds.
Yes, what a film.
So we'll be back in just a second. Stay tuned. Okay.
Thanks for listening to the Film Swap podcast. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Audible, and Google Podcasts, or any of your favourite podcast catchers. If you like this podcast, please consider giving the show a rating or leaving a review. This helps other listeners find the show.
You sound like you're a little confused by the revolution in action, E.G. Up to now, you've only dealt with it in theory. What did you think this thing was going to be? A revolution by consensus, where we all sat down and agreed over a cup of coffee?
Nothing works. 4 million people died last year, not from fighting a war. They died from starvation and typhus in a militaristic police state that suppresses freedom and human rights where nothing works.
They died because of a French, British, and American blockade that cut off all food and medical supplies, and because counter-revolutionaries have sabotaged the factories and the railroads and the telephones, and because the people, the poor, ignorant, superstitious, illiterate people, are trying to run things themselves, just as you always said that they should, but they don't know how to run them yet. Did you really think things were going to work right away? Did you really expect social transformation to be anything other than a murderous process? It's a war, E.G., and we got to fight it like we fight a war with discipline, with terror, with firing squads, or we just give it up.
And we're back.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, welcome back, listeners. I hope you enjoyed that little break as much as we did. I had a nice sip of my lovely lemon and ginger tea, which is why I'm availing myself tonight.
I had a sip of water.
Lovely, lovely. So we're on the hard stuff tonight. That's what podcasting drives you to in the end. But we're going to solve it.
Not very rebellious. So, yes, the two films, although Lenny was made in 1974 and Reds was made released in 1974 and Reds was released in 1981, we are going to look at Reds first, because that, in terms of the chronology of their sort of fictional eras they address, that comes first, because this is set in the sort of 19-teens, really, in the 19-teens.
The teens.
90s.
Yeah, absolutely.
And whereas the others in the sort of 50s and 60s, Lenny. So it's your film, Reds.
I chose Reds. Tonight, the brief was we decided we were going to do biopics, and then we both, after some consideration, put our films forward. And it turns out that we kind of slightly adjusted the theme, because both of the films are very much about people who are fighting against the system, basically. So hence the title, Real Rebels. Yep. The film I picked is a great favorite of mine called Reds. It was directed by Warren Beatty, and it came out in 1981. But apparently the project goes back to the late 60s. He wrote a first draft of the script in about sort of 1967, 68, something like that. But it took him many years and to get the project together. It also stars Beatty in the lead role as John Reed, who was a great journalist and activist for the Communist Party in the early 20th century. And he's most famous for writing a book, 10 Days That Shook the World, which was a book that he wrote about his experiences when he was in Russia in 1917 during the October Revolution. Yep. So that became kind of the seminal book, I guess in English anyway, presumably, that chronicled that event. He was one of the few Americans who was present, along with his wife, played by Diane Keaton, whose name was Louise Bryant, who's also quite a seminal figure at the time. She was part of the suffragette movement. And then later became a journalist herself and married John Reed, and together they were quite active in journalism and writing and traveling around the world, and also as activists for the communist socialist movement. Is probably more appropriate to say. Yep. So Reds basically charts really it charts not just John Reed's experiences as a journalist during that time, but also it's very much a film about the relationship between those two,
Yes.
between Louise Bryant and John Reed, and their very, at times, quite volatile relationship.
Yeah.
They were quite kind of, with the correct term, Jonathan, be kind of libertarian in their views about relationships and things. I think they both...
Pretty free, definitely.
Yes, they kind of were early advocates of the free love kind of philosophy, about the idea about not being possessive in relationships. And as a result of that, of course, they were always upsetting each other by sleeping around with other people.
Basically, which is quite amusing.
Yes, well, some things, dogmas can be like that, can't they? Sometimes in practice, they don't quite work out as well as they do when you're theorizing. So basically, that's the story it's a big, huge, epic, sprawling film that takes place over sort of about a 10-year period.
It's actually 5 years, yeah. Because the first scene's is 1915, and then it finishes basically in 1920, pretty much.
Yeah, and it charts initially the kind of first part of the film is about how the two meet and how their relationship develops, and then how John Reed's kind of activism starts to develop, and then towards the kind of the middle part of the film, they actually make their, which would have been quite a dangerous trip to Russia at the time.
Yeah.
They had to kind of sneak in, and they weren't allowed to go because the American government didn't allow people to travel there. And then when they're there, they witness firsthand the October Revolution and the huge upheaval in society. And they were kind of there just before, so they witnessed a lot of the social conditions that were developing at the time that led to what happened. And this was also during the First World War, so the economic hardships compounded with the sort of the war that was raging, which is what led to the revolution at the time. So then they come back to the United States, where they write their books and become then quite famous, and then quite active in the developing communist parties at the time, and the labor movement, and how that was developing. And I think John Reed very much was hoping that a similar thing that happened in Russia would happen in the United States. And so he was quite vocal. He was quite an active anti-war activist, and worked for the Communist Party and the unions and things to help organize. He wanted, I think, a revolution to happen in the United States. And then the later part of the film is partially about how the American government tried to suppress that activism, and were very sort of heavy-handed in their fear of something happening. And then John Reed gets sent back to Russia to help get recognition for the political party that he's associated with, but he ends up basically getting trapped there because, of course, after the revolution, the Western governments sent in troops to sort of blockade the country in order to sort of stop the revolution really from being successful, to apply economic pressure to the country to perhaps curtail what was happening.
Yeah, but I also got the feeling that they just didn't want him to go back as well. That's what I felt. It was a bit confusing, but it felt like, no, you're much more useful to us here. Don't go back. Do you feel that? Do you think that's what they were saying?
Well, I think he was quite openly, because there was some friction between various factions of the kind of Communist Party in the United States at the time. They kind of fractured and had, sort of infighting and scrapping, and they ended up splintering into various groups. And so he was sent back to Russia to gain get the endorsement of the Bolshevik government that was in Russia at the time. So that was why he went back. I don't think he really wanted to go back at the time. He was more keen on staying in America, but he did sort of do his duty, and he had to sneak into the country to do it via Finland.
Yep.
And then at a certain point he gets arrested as well and spent some time in prison in Finland, I think.
Yes.
Which really affected his health. His health deteriorated quite badly at the time because he had kidney problems and things like that.
Yeah.
So basically, this is what the story is. It's basically a big sprawling epic, as I said, that kind of covers that period, very tumultuous period in early 20th century history. And he's obviously quite an interesting figure. And he also was associated with a lot of really famous sort of writers and activists and things at the time. Jack Nicholson appears in the film as what's his name, Eugene O'Neill, the writer, and he plays quite an important part in the early stage of the film because himself and Louise Bryant had a relationship while John Reed was off on his travels and things and on his adventures, and that forms part of the story. And Maureen Stapleton also appears as she won an Academy Award for a performance in this film, playing Emma Goldman, who was quite an early feminist activist and who advocated for sort of the development of birth control and women's voting and all sorts of things. So she's quite an interesting character. So there's lots of really great historical figures that come in and out of the story. Gene Hackman's in it as a newspaper editor, I believe, that hired John Reed at a certain point. It's only a small role. He's in only in a couple of scenes, but they're quite pivotal ones. So there's a great cast. The film was partially shot in the UK, so there's a lot of British actors that pop up at various stages. And Shane Rimmer, one of the voices from the Thunderbirds, is in it as well as one of his mates, who lived here in the UK, so he did things here, but he was originally Canadian. Yes, Jonathan, tell us what you thought of Reds.
Well, I thought it was a really good film, actually, and I'd heard about it.
Is this your first time seeing it?
It's my first time seeing it, yeah. I'd heard about it, and I knew that it was sort of Warren Beatty's sort of passion project, and I think perhaps I read about it in Easy Riders and Raging Bulls, where I sort of learned to, I haven't seen all the films mentioned in that book. I thought it was going to be a bit more sort of political in a way, and I guess it is political, but as you said earlier, it's more about I suppose the main story is their sort of relationship, the two main characters, Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton, and I thought that was handled very well. I really liked the arguments, because of course they have arguments here, and I thought they were just very well written, just extremely realistic somehow. How they were sort of both right, but they just couldn't agree, and they had sort of cross purposes. Just brilliant. I really liked these sort of milieu that they were in, or sort of like a slice. It was a slice of social history. You could see them because he started off. John Reed came from a sort of relatively wealthy background, I suppose, in Oregon, and then moved from that to New York, where it was much more sort of bohemian and political. But that's the interesting thing. It wasn't just political. It was a bohemian atmosphere. So he was hanging around with lots of, sort of writers.
Yeah,
people
in
like
Greenwich Village, wasn't it, at the time? Which was, I guess, quite. That's where that sort of whole scene developed in New York at the time.
Exactly, and I suppose we've all heard of, I suppose, the beatniks in the sort of 50s and the lost generation in the 20s, but he was from a generation just before then, who aren't quite so well known, but they were very much sort of precursors of that sort of alternative living and bohemianism, which is really interesting to see. And he's a great character because he is very committed to his cause, but you don't lose sort of sympathy with him. Even you might not agree with him, but he's still a sort of sympathetic character. And although maybe his sort of ideals take him in a slightly, I don't know, strange route, but that's all part of it. And really enjoyable film.
Yeah, I mean, towards the end, of his life, he obviously, after the revolution, then, of course, in any situation like that, then the kind of, the actual practical details of building a new government and a new, administration and all those things.
Yeah.
And he was quite active when he was in Russia. He was drawn into all that, and I think he at least the film betrays, and some people historically have said that towards the end he became a bit more disillusioned with that process.
Yeah.
But he still very much was committed to it right up till the end, and he did obviously all the stress of the time he spent in prison and all the things about where he couldn't get back home, and he didn't know the whereabouts of his wife. He couldn't get, this is before the days of cell phones and airplanes and things like that. So traveling to places took months. There wasn't always easy communication between, certainly between countries and over long distances, and especially in places where there's wars and things going on. So there was all that kind of frustration and fear and anxiety and stuff that plays into it. And I think Warren Beatty does a great job through the course of the film, because towards the end, his health is failing and he's found himself sort of trapped in this situation. And obviously it would have been quite stressful. So he does a very good job at, like you say, sort of maintaining that balance between the stress and the sort of the dogmatic, sticking to his sort of principles.
Yes.
But at the same time, you see him as a human being and very vulnerable and all those things. I think it's amazing because Warren Beatty directed this. He co-wrote it. And it was a huge project. So you have to give him his dues for just the fact that he's also turns in a really, really great performance in this.
Amazing to think he was directing it as well as acting in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Diane Keaton, apparently he and Diane Keaton at the time were in a relationship. And apparently through the course of the many months of making this huge behemoth of a project, it did put quite a lot of strain on their relationship and things as well.
Yeah.
But she's absolutely wonderful. And as well, as you say, I mean, she's, just terrific through the course of the film.
Yeah.
Is a very independent spirit, and as someone who has her own sort of, she wants to develop her own career, and she has her own ideas, but then she's also drawn to this character, and they really develop a really strong bond through the course of the film, and it's really works really well.
Well, I was wondering about that because I suppose Diane Keaton's best known for comedies, maybe, also perhaps lighter roles.
Maybe for the most part. I mean, now that you say that, I'm thinking about her, if she's ever done like a lot of really sort of heavy dramatic roles, and probably this is the only one that really springs to mind.
I'm sort of thinking of stuff with Woody Allen and things like that, and
absolutely.
So extremely talented woman, but this is a sort of slightly different role for her to what we're used to, or what I'm used to. I'm not familiar with all her work, but really good performance, and their sort of their intense relationship, and that's one of the things that is quite interesting, because the film is it's classified in the American Film Institute has it as in their AFI's top 10, where they get people, I think, in the film community rating it, and it came 9th in the epic genre. So that's what it is. It's an epic. And it does sort of share that, I suppose, with Dr. Zhivago is the obvious example around this, sort of set in the same era. You know, a long film, because it's long, 3 hours and 15 minutes. It even has, like with Heaven's Gate, it has a sort of intermission card in the middle.
It does in the sort of about halfway mark. There is a little sort of break there for an intermission.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things, I sort of looked at when they first mentioned the Russian Revolution, it's I think an hour and 4 minutes into the film. So you're sort of more, a third of the way through already, and they haven't even mentioned it. Not that they haven't got there, they haven't even mentioned it. And then by the time they got there, I think it's another half hour before they actually get to Russia. So a lot of it's actually in, well, sort of almost half of it sort of before they reach Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first half of the film is essentially kind of like the kind of a romance story in a sense. It's the relationship between these two characters, and then as it progresses, then they go off and have their sort of the adventures in Russia, which lead to their sort of fame or I suppose notoriety, depending on if you were asking someone who worked at in the FBI or something.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot of that part of the film is quite interesting too, because it very much shows about in terms of the struggles about how these political activists, the union organizers and things in the United States at this time, how they were very much kind of persecuted and hounded by law enforcement, and the government tried everything they could to crack down, and obviously that carried on right on for the decades that followed, but there's a lot of interesting ideas and things that are discussed in the film. One of the things that I quite enjoy about it as well is the witnesses, because throughout the film,
we haven't mentioned this. We should have mentioned this a bit earlier. This is actually
probably because it's quite a pivotal way in which the film is structured. Because although they aren't identified,
we should explain what the witnesses are.
Well, okay. Do you want to do it, or shall I do it?
Yeah. So, in sort of the film, intermittently through the film, there are these sort of talking heads on a sort of black or grey background, and they're these ancient old sort of people, and they're talking about their memories of John Reed and Rebecca Bryant and the events at the time. And it's really, I thought at first, because I'd read about that before I sort of saw the film, and I thought, it's going to really slow the action down if you suddenly sort of stop to listen to some old geezer waffling on. But actually, it doesn't. It really doesn't. And
Not at all. It's quite pivotal, I think, to propelling the narrative along, because they kind of set the stage. They describe kind of the events that are going on at the time. Some of them, it's interesting because in the film they're not identified about who they are, but some of them clearly knew John Reed or Louise Bryant or both of them, and some of them also just sort of make reference to sort of the historical events during that time.
Yes.
Some of them come across a bit better than others, because some of them almost just sound like they're kind of gossiping old biddies, or and there's one chap in particular who makes comments that are a bit dismissive of John Reed's kind of politics and his ideas and things. But all of these people, as it turns out, because they were apparently identified later on by the Washington Post after the film had been out, that they actually identify this list of people, and it's actually a lot of really quite interesting people. I'm not going to list them all because there's quite a few. It's quite a long list, but there's people who are journalists. entertainers, people who were active in the American Civil Liberties Union, people who worked with John Reed at The Masses, which was a magazine that he wrote for, people who were involved with the Communist Party, and other journalists and government officials. So it's these are quite interesting people.
Yeah.
But in the film, they are only referred to as witnesses.
Yes,
They don't say who they are on screen or anything. They're just these elderly people who are reminiscing about the events that are then depicted in the film.
Yeah, well, they have. I recognised two of them. So there's old Arthur Miller. Of the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn.
Henry Miller, isn't it?
Henry, not Arthur. Henry. Yeah, you're right. Sorry, the novelist. Yeah, there's two famous Millers writers in that same period, well, roughly the same period. Yeah, he was, and so I recognised his face, and he sort of, he was not really. He was part of the Bohemian, not communist sort of side of the scene. And then also there was an English voice, Rebecca West. She's a very interesting woman. She was had a relationship with H.G. Wells, and she hosted Emma Goldman when she came back to the West from Russia. Because Emma Goldman came back and she was very disillusioned with the revolution, and she had a Emma Goldman gave a speech in London apparently, and people were walking out because they couldn't believe that the revolution was anything other than utterly perfect. Anyway, so she
depicted in the later part of the film. They do show Maureen Stapleton, who plays Emma Gold. They do have a couple of scenes where her frustration with the process of reestablishing a government after the revolution is touched upon in the later part of the film.
Yeah, exactly. So, but anyway, it's really interesting. Perhaps on the DVD they could have had sort of options to see this, the names of the witnesses. I don't know, but I just watched it on Amazon, so I didn't have that option. But I would have liked to know who was who.
Well, it is really, I think it's like quite one of the most interesting parts of the film, because it does ground it in the historical facts, and that you have people who are really commenting on because they knew the people. So it gives the film an extra layer of kind of authenticity almost. Yeah. It really does kind of propel the narrative as well, because I think it would probably be a little bit harder to understand some of the kind of the transitions without them. Apparently, some of the filming too, Warren Beatty started making these little filmed interviews with all of these witnesses many years prior to the actual production of the film. He had already started, because that just shows you how long this project gestated before it actually finally fell into place. And it's interesting that it was made around the same time. A couple of weeks ago we spoke about Heaven's Gate, which was another big, huge behemoth production that had all kinds of problems, and was a huge, monumental, super expensive extravaganza, and kind of ego-driven by the main sort of director, in this case Warren Beatty. It was his passion project, and he was apparently very sort of obsessive and highly a lot of attention to detail, and like I said, it kind of strained some of his relationships and things, because he was very driven with this. But unlike Heaven's Gate, this film was quite a success at the time. It was highly critically acclaimed, and was a very successful at the box office, and made loads of money back and things for the investors and things. So, and it won Academy Awards. It won, did it win Best Picture? I don't think it did. It lost out to, Beatty was awarded Academy Award for Best Director. It lost out to Chariots of Fire. That was the one. I couldn't think of it.
Okay.
But, apparently Chariots of Fire won the Best Picture that year.
Right.
There you have it. So here's another example. We could we could call this another Oscar Blunders 2 as well, because here was a film that did not win the Best Picture Oscar. It lost out to Chariots of Fire, which is a pretty good film, to be fair.
It is a good film. It's also set in a similar time, so 10 years
It
later.
was actually, yeah,
Well
indeed.
enough. One of the good things about the witnesses is that it's sort of, because of course in a film you have to have a point of view, but the witnesses allow us to sort of see the different recollections and sort of different points of view. So there's one,
Absolutely.
especially a bit that I wrote down, there's one person says, and this is sort of during the First World War, one person says, there was a lot of anti-war feeling, and then the next talking head says, there was no one against the war. So,
Yes.
you know, this gives you an idea of the sort of what we're dealing with when it comes to history, really.
Yes. And I mean, you even see that a lot today. People who have an opinion about something, there's an assumption that there's just millions of others, the masses behind me, who are right thinking about what I feel and what I think about things. So that's quite interesting. Interesting as well.
Yes, one of the things that I found particularly, well, sort of like tangentially interesting is that it features the Polish-American writer Jerzy Kaczynski, and he plays the sort of Russian politician Grigory Zinoviev. And Jerzy Kaczynski, if you haven't heard of him, wrote a book that was turned into Peter Sellers' last film, Being There, which is a terrific movie.
Yeah, I love Being There, yeah.
So he wasn't an actor, I don't think, as far as I know, but he wrote. But somehow he was a friend of Warren Beatty, and he managed to persuade him to play this role, which was
apparently he didn't want to play it because he didn't want to play a communist, but
that's true.
But Warren Beatty sort of convinced him to do it.
Yeah.
I don't know why he was so determined. I guess they do have some quite similar. Like he looked a bit like the chap he was playing, I suppose. So perhaps that was partly it. He was just the right physical type.
Yeah.
But he's quite interesting in the film, actually, and he's quite pivotal because he basically just demands that John Reed sort of stay in Russia at the time, like because John Reed comes to him at a certain point in the film and said, I want to go home. Can you help arrange to essentially sneak me safely back out of the country so I can get home? And he just flat out refuses and says, no, this is the revolution and our families aren't important. Nothing's important except the revolution, and you need to stay here and get the job done.
Yeah.
And he's a bit like that. He just sort of bosses him around and tells him, you got to do this, you got to do that.
Yes.
And this is part of sort of John Reed's frustration towards the end of the film, is that he's sort of become, in a sense, a pawn, and somewhat unwilling pawn in the political machinations of these chaps who are trying to organize a government and work out a new administration. So.
Yeah. One of the things I really liked also was the mise en scène, and that's something I don't normally talk about in this. But basically, the sort of sets, especially, were extraordinary, really, really sort of atmospheric and authentic seeming. So they're sort of, when they're in America, they live in these sort of often in cottages and sort of rather run down little cottages as well. And I think they were actually, the outside of the cottage was somewhere in England, but the inside the set builders built. But you wouldn't know. It sort of looks like a real cottage, really well done. And the houses in Russia, these massive sort of faded mansions and faded apartment buildings, are really really well done as well. I think they filmed those in various sort of government buildings in the sort of the centre of London, and also in Finland as well. Exterior shots in Finland, which has that sort of Russian architecture because it was part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. It's really that bit of it is. It just had that sort of very worn out look that sort of Russia at that time must have had.
It's a beautiful looking film, isn't it? The photography is beautiful.
Yes.
Vittorio Storaro, I want to make sure I say his name right. but he's absolutely amazing photographer for this. He shot Apocalypse Now.
Oh,
And,
yes.
The Last Emperor.
Yeah.
The Conformist. Wow.
Yeah.
So this is The Bird with the Crystal Plumage he shot, which is a really one of the most famous giallo films and really beautiful looking film as well. Last Tango in Paris.
Right.
Wow. So and he shot for Warren Beatty later on is Dick Tracy.
Okay.
As well.
Yeah.
Amazing.
See, he did The Sheltering Sky, which is a terrific movie.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah. So he's quite an accomplished cinematographer.
Definitely.
So another reason to watch this film, because it is absolutely beautiful. There's some absolutely stunning images and things in it.
Yes.
It's absolutely beautiful. So with Reds, how did you watch it? Yeah, I think you mentioned you watched it on Amazon.
I watched it on Amazon Prime, where I sort of rented it for the night, or for 2 nights. You can rent it for, I think it was about £2.50. If you watch it in low-fi rather than sort of hi-fi or whatever it is.
Oh, it's worth that extra quid, Jonathan, to get the high definition. It's beautiful. I watched it. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to go and get it, but you could probably see it because it's still sitting out there over there. I watched it on the Paramount's new Blu-ray, which just came out, I think, at the end of last year. And I was very excited about that because despite the film, this film was at the time a really big, huge film. And like I said, it won Oscars and was a huge, box office success and everything. Yet, over the last sort of couple of decades, it's kind of fallen into somewhat relative obscurity. I mean, it's been kind of around. You could get hold of it if you really looked for it, but it hasn't been sort of kind of out there in people's faces like it was at the time when it came out. And for some reason, there hadn't been a Blu-ray, like a decent Blu-ray edition that had been released. Mainly, I mean, Paramount hasn't been great. They never really jumped on the Blu-ray bandwagon and exploited their back catalog, but that seems to have changed over the last few years. So they've started digging out some stuff and getting them out on Blu-rays and 4Ks. And so finally they did Reds, and it is an absolutely beautiful Blu-ray. The transfer is gorgeous, and it's the best I've ever seen it. Brilliant. So definitely that one's worth picking up. So folks, go out and see this movie. If you've never seen it before, it's time you corrected that oversight, because it's a really terrific film. It is a really good film.
And I would say one little sort of comment is that I don't feel like you don't have to be a communist to enjoy it. Anybody could enjoy it, really. I think
well, and I think it's a positive thing because it is obviously there's a lot, especially when you hear today, like a lot of sort of politicians and stuff will make comments all the time, usually when they're trying to dig at somebody or something. They'll make these ridiculous comments. There's a lot of misconceptions and things about communism and socialism and all these things. And I think this film's quite valuable in the sense that it can give you a little bit of insight into the struggles and the big changes and upheavals in the early 20th century in between the two world wars and things. And I think this film can give you a little bit and kind of humanizes those things to very well in terms of giving you a little bit of perspective on what was really going on. And really gives you a sort of more of an understanding of that time in history and what was happening. So I think that is one of the reasons why it's a really great film and worth checking out. So folks, go out and see it. Definitely. But don't do it right now, because Jonathan and I are going to take just a few seconds break, and then we're going to come back and talk about our second film, another real rebel, in Lenny Bruce, the stand-up comedian, and who perhaps inadvertently became a great champion for sort of free speech and creative expression. So he's a very, very interesting character and an interesting story and a really great movie. So we're going to just take a few minutes break. But from your perspective, listener, it's only going to be a few seconds. And then Jonathan and I will be back to talk about Lenny.
You can follow the Film Swap on social media. We're on Twitter and TikTok at Film Swap UK, on Instagram at Film Swap Media, and on YouTube at Film Swap_podcast, and at Facebook at Film Swap the Podcast.
Don't shut him up. You need that madman to stand up, tell you when you're blowing it. And the harder you come down on the deviant, the more you need him. Please, don't take away my words. They're just words. I'm not hurting anybody.
And we're back. And I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan to introduce his film tonight, which is Bob Fosse's 1974, Lenny.
Yes, Lenny was directed by Bob Fosse, and Bob Fosse directed, was probably best known for Cabaret, would you say? But he started life as a dancer, I think, and became a film director. He also made Sweet Charity, which has Warren Beatty's sister in it, old Shirley MacLaine.
Yeah, she's terrific. She's terrific.
She is terrific.
I love Shirley MacLaine, actually.
Yeah, and I guess, and also Chicago, the original Chicago film, not the remake.
Yeah. And all that jazz, which is a great one. It's kind of an autobiographical one.
Oh, is it? Okay, I haven't.
It's Roy Scheider.
Okay, I haven't seen that one. But a lot of his films are films about sort of, they're not just musicals, but about the sort of nightlife and
show business.
Show business. Thank you very much. And so if Reds is about sort of political activists with a sort of, who also mix in a sort of bohemian milieu, with old Lenny, it's more the bohemian milieu rather than the political activists, although there is a little bit of, it does get a little political sort of as the film progresses and as his life progresses. And so Lenny Bruce was born in 1925 and died in 1966. And he sort of, I guess he was just a normal sort of comedian, performing in the Catskills to sort of Jewish sort of hotels and social clubs. And then somehow he fell in with sort of a different crowd and started, as he puts it, it all changed when 1 hour in, the film says, it all changed when I started to improvise, or when he started to improvise. Perhaps it's his manager that says that. So that then he basically does observational comedy rather than the sort of gags in the traditional sense. And he addresses lots of controversial subjects like sort of drugs and sex, and uses words that hadn't been used on stage before. He basically starts swearing, which hasn't happened before. And he gets in trouble with the law, who comes down on him basically for the crime of obscenity, which is something, I mean, I'm not sure if it even exists anymore. Certainly you don't hear about it very much. But he also basically managed to develop a drug problem, not just a drug problem, but a heroin problem, which doesn't turn out very well when he gets very stressed by all the sort of legal problems he has for his obscenity, so-called. And, well, it's not telling you much that basically he sort of dies of a heroin overdose at the end of the film. But this is, I guess, one of Dustin Hoffman's great roles up there with Tootsie and The Graduate and
Little Big Man and
Little Big Man as well.
Time and all. Like this, Lenny kind of came out right in that kind of his peak.
Yeah.
Kind of career peak, wasn't it, in the kind of early to mid 70s? I mean, he was absolutely on fire. Just a string of really amazing roles.
Yes.
And this is one of them. Just an absolutely amazing performance, isn't it? Just
terrific. And 'cause I think I first saw it on Moviedrome, which I think we mentioned once before, and I can see that on the Wikipedia page it was shown on the 27th of June 1993, and that must have been the time I saw it before last weekend. And I remember watching it and thinking, I had seen The Graduate before, but I remember thinking, this is why Dustin Hoffman is so revered.
yes,
Because and around the same time they had on the TV they had Little Big Man, which is another terrific movie, and I think Tootsie at the same time actually. You know, all three films, all four films, absolutely brilliant. But this one sort of, I guess, it stood out. It's all in black and white, which I guess is a little bit experimental. And it's sort of filmed in like a mockumentary almost, or so part of it. They have lots of talking heads again, but these are fictional talking heads. These are actors.
It is stylistically, it has that similarity with Reds, doesn't it? In that, although these aren't actual, like in Reds, it's actually genuine interviews with real people talking about real events, whereas here it's obviously the actors portraying these people, but they're being interviewed by like a newspaper journalist or something to that effect.
Exactly. And so, which is quite nice again, because you get the sort of different perspectives on the guy, like you did in Reds. And I guess one of the good things about this is that he's a very flawed character. I mean, John Reed is flawed as well, and he makes mistakes. But Lenny is more flawed. I guess he's got big flaws,
yes, he's quite an insecure character.
Yeah, he's insecure. And I guess that's probably the root of his drug addiction. But it also asks really interesting questions about sort of language. And he says he really pushes the boundaries. Even now you think, golly, he's saying that then, and he asks questions that we can sort of still ask now about language, or how much censorship should there be, and or how much free speech should there be. Yeah, really.
And I thought that whole idea of obscenity, because here is like it just seems to be this really fluid thing that can be used really as a political tool to shut people up, right? And like, how do you define obscenity? Where exactly are the boundaries? Because there are these obscenity laws in the United States at the time when Lenny Bruce was being essentially persecuted by law enforcement. I mean, there's even a great scene when he's in the courtroom and he just asks the judge and he says, well, what words am I not allowed to say? What, there's no clear definition of exactly what obscenity is. It just seems to be completely open to the interpretation of whoever is applying the law. So it essentially comes down to whatever they feel is obscene, not necessarily, there isn't necessarily any specific public standard that you could adhere to say this is obscene. And what might offend one person might not offend somebody else. So that is what makes it quite an interesting debate and quite an interesting issue. And I think this film explores that really, really well.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things I wrote down, what is dirty? I guess that's one of the questions it sort of asks. But it also has these characters, these parties that he goes to, especially early on, they're filmed just really interestingly. Lots of sort of close-ups, and all the characters, the faces, they look like they're people who he picked up in nightclubs. Basically, they're sort of not sort of classic sort of Hollywood people. And it's really interesting that they have. He also addresses religion as well. Dustin Hoffman, that's another sort of taboo breaker he does there. And it's interesting because I think he made the film he made before this was Cabaret, and that's another film sort of set in a nightclub. This is sort of set in a nightclub where sort of social change is sort of being made, boundaries are being pushed. In the case of Cabaret, everything gets sort of completely shut down, whereas in this film, you think, right, Lenny doesn't sort of make it to the end in a way, but his message in a way marches on. I think we can say.
Indeed. I mean, he was a real trailblazer, wasn't he? He took all the pain and the persecution and all the flack, but he kind of paved the way for the future. That was just around the corner in terms of sort of the counterculture and comedians. I think someone who I'm a great admirer of, who was quite openly influenced by him, was George Carlin, who was quite a great social critic, and his comedy was very much sort of in the same vein of sort of showing up about.
Came over here. In fact, until I looked at the Wikipedia page this evening, when it said he was an influence on George Carlin, I thought, who's that guy?
Oh, my goodness. George Carlin. All you have to do is go on YouTube, just type in George Carlin, and you will, if you're not familiar with him, you definitely need to see him because he was brilliant. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but he was absolutely brilliant man. Yeah. One of the absolute great stand-up comedians, and brilliantly perceptive, and just cuts through all of the absurdity and hypocrisy and ridiculousness of modern civilization and politics and religion and everything, and you can definitely see just from this film, you can see how Lenny Bruce was clearly a massive influence on his type of comedy, and So there you go, Jonathan, and listeners out there as well. If you're not familiar with George Carlin, you need to go out and I know we're a film show, we talk about cinema here, but and I'm not really a big stand-up comedian, aficionado at all. I'm not really big on it at all. I'm not a fan particularly, but George Carlin, I rate very highly. He's a very, very clever man indeed. Yeah. So go and check him out. But anyway, back to Lenny.
Yes.
I think one thing that it definitely bears mentioning, as we mentioned her a little bit at the beginning, but is Valerie Perrin, who's the love interest. It was his wife, Lenny Bruce's wife. She plays, her name was Honey Bruce. And she was, I guess, for lack of a better term, she was like a burlesque dancer, or I guess a stripper, what you would call her. And she met Lenny Bruce at some point, and they the film traces their at times very volatile relationship, but she was obviously quite a central figure in his life. And after he passed away, she apparently was the one who sort of kept his sort of persona alive and helped to keep his memory alive. But she's absolutely amazing in this film. Apparently, this is one of her very early roles. This is she'd maybe only done one or two films before this one.
Right.
And she's absolutely amazing in this. Just quite a great actress. I mean, she's someone who hasn't really... I mean, aside from the Superman films with Christopher Reeve,
she was in those, was she?
Played kind of a supporting role in those. I don't think she really went on to, do a lot of really high-profile things after after the early '80s.
Yeah.
But definitely very talented lady and really great actress. And there's lots of films that she's been in that I've seen that she's really, really good in. But she was in Slaughterhouse-5, and she was in that W.C. Fields biopic.
Yep.
Electric Horseman with Robert Redford. But again, she never really sort of, kind of really hit the big time and had a lot of great roles after that, unfortunately. But I think she's, as you said, she's still alive. And
she has Parkinson's, unfortunately, so I guess
that's a shame.
Probably means that she won't be acting.
But anyway, I'm here tonight to give her a shout out, Valerie Perrin, because I think she was quite a talented actress, and definitely from Lenny. I mean, this was a great performance indeed. Like, she's very, very powerful in it, and so I thought it was worth making sure she got a shout out.
Yes, absolutely.
So anything else that you wanted to say about, I mean, we could talk a lot. I mean, the one thing I find is that the one thing that this film, because it is very much centers on Lenny Bruce's sort of personality and his personal life and his later struggles with the law and his, his legal battles and his drug addiction. One thing that I guess if I was going to, I guess if you could call it a criticism, is that I think the one thing that the film doesn't do very well is really show you why he was such a trailblazing comedian, really. There's not a lot of footage of him performing.
No.
There's only a few little sort of set pieces like the little bit that got him in trouble in the first place, talking about, well, I'll just refer to it as oral sex, so I won't say the actual word, but also, some of the other stuff. But yeah, I mean, he was quite a huge figure. He used to play at the Fillmore, and
that was one of his last gigs, I think.
And he was like a huge kind of star on the sort of live kind of concert circuit and things, and became quite a sort of a cult figure during that time period when he was alive. And that's the one thing that I don't think the film really sort of capitalizes on, is really showing him a lot of his act and things like that. It only kind of shows the key bits, the key moments that got him into trouble, and sort of his early thing when he obviously, because what you don't really get is that sense of his evolution of his comedy and of his act, because at the beginning they show him that he was just a kind of a playing in these burlesque clubs and doing kind of really cheesy shtick and bad impressions and things, and you don't really get that sense of how he evolves his act into becoming this really trailblazing sort of,
That's true. In fact, I wrote down a sort of thought on this as I was watching it, because I did sort of think, it's not this is, I guess this is one of the sort of possible weaknesses with the film, is that I wasn't really laughing out loud, sort of splitting my sides watching it. But at the same time, I thought, well, I mean, actually, Dustin Hoffman can be very funny, and more recently he's done loads of funny films. But here, in a way, I thought he doesn't really have to be funny, because that's not really the purpose of the film. The film is really about what he's talking about rather than how he's saying it.
And I mean, to be fair too, he would have been a product of his time, and it's quite possible that if we went back, I mean, there are a lot of Lenny Bruce recordings, like live recordings of his gigs and things that are out there. But the thing is, quite possibly, if you listen to them, then maybe they wouldn't hold up very well and be that funny.
Yeah.
Because he's obviously since been, there's been loads and loads of comedians since then that have sort of taken what he started and kind of run with it and gone, much, much further and much deeper than he did. So, sometimes that's the way it works, isn't it? So you might look back and, I mean, that happens with films, doesn't it? You can look at a film and at the time it would have been quite amazing and groundbreaking and things. But if you showed a younger viewer now and they looked at it, they might look at it and go, yeah, meh, because they wouldn't really understand the context of how it was so, trend-setting or so boundary breaking at the time.
That's
and I'm
true.
sure you could say that about Lenny Bruce as well, is that perhaps a lot of his stuff would seem quite tame by today's standards, and you listen to it and go, what's the big deal? But in 1960 he was quite a groundbreaker.
Massive deal, yeah. And there's one of the characters, I think, towards the end says, I think maybe after he's died, they say the thing about Lenny was he was so damn funny. And that sort of, I sort of felt like I needed that because I was sort of, that way you get this idea that the guy's personality was one of these funny people who would make you laugh about anything. And so even if perhaps Dustin Hoffman's character is in this thing, or Dustin Hoffman's performance isn't so damn funny, at least we know sort of roughly what we're talking about. I think it's really about his sort of political, well, not his struggle against the courts and everything in many ways at the end. Isn't it?
And it's about, I mean, he was a kind of in a way, a tragic figure, but
he
also
was definitely a tragic
quite,
figure,
like an important seminal figure in moving things forward and fighting against censorship and the whole, an advocate of free speech and, breaking those boundaries down. And he was, in his way, I guess, a political figure, because a lot of his comedy poked fun and took swipes at, sort of the establishment and the, and things like that. So he obviously was quite an important figure. But the film is a drama, and it's about his life and his struggles and his kind of tragic end. So you're right that perhaps a comedy isn't that important, but I think that is the one thing, if I was going to say anything, that would be what I would say against the film, is that you don't really get a real sense of his act. And that's the one thing that makes me interesting. But I think if people were really interested in that, there are, like I said, a lot of recordings and things out there of that were done when he was alive and when he was working, so people could go and check that out and listen to the real deal and get a sense of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, when I was researching Reds, I saw that Emma Goldman, when she was in Russia, she spoke. When she had a chat to Lenin, because she was sort of saying, what about all this sort of, what about freedom of speech? And Lenin said to her, freedom of speech is bourgeois superstition. So basically, I don't think Lenny would have got on very well with Lenin either. So he was.
Perhaps not. We'll never know. But I think Lenin might have approved of some of Lenny Bruce's commentary on
maybe
American society.
One of the things that John Reed said was that Lenin was utterly humorless, or something like that, in the when he in his sort of, because they read out this sort of newspaper report. Anyway, but that's getting slightly sidetracked. But I mean, both films sort of they address sort of freedom of speech, I guess, to an extent, with Reds as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the thing that, because that's happened to us several times through the course of this show now, hasn't it, that we sort of inadvertently stumble on, we both put forward films that
Yeah,
have sort of, thematically and things that tie together quite nicely.
yeah.
And again, it wasn't a planned thing. We originally just said, "Oh, okay, we're going to do biopics," and then you immediately, you didn't even waste any time thinking about it, did you, Jonathan?
Nope.
You just came back to me and said, "I think I'd like to do Lenny."
Yeah.
And then I kind of went, "Well, you know what? I was thinking about doing Reds."
Yeah. having watched it 30 years ago, can you believe it? That's nuts.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, you know what? The first time I saw Reds, this would have been back when it was pretty much new. I remember as a teenager, one of the things that really developed my film, how I became a real sort of cinema buff and film fan was in the very early 80s, around 1983, I'm going to say, going from memory, is in Canada they launched sort of what they call pay television channels. They were kind of movie-based channels that were ad-free, but you had to pay a subscription, and they were just available on the cable, and you paid a separate subscription to get these channels, and they just showed movies, like just in America it was like HBO and Showtime and those kind of things. So in Canada it was First Choice and Super Channel. They had these 24-hour movie networks, and you paid a subscription fee. So we got them at my house, and that's how I would have been sort of a teenager, 14, 15 years old. Yeah. And I just was then exposed to all these films on these channels, and Reds was one of them that, again, made kind of like Heaven's Gate. It was just one of these big, huge, sprawling epics that just made a huge impression on me as a formative sort of teenager, sort of for immersing myself in all these films and things. Yeah, Reds was one of the films that really made a huge impression on me. Yeah, so it was one I was quite keen to talk about when we talked about biopics. I thought, yeah, it's a biopic.
It is a biopic, pretty much, Reds.
Yeah. It's just recently sort of the Blu-ray that's come out, so it's more sort of fresh in my mind as well. So great. So a couple of really great films. It was really great to revisit both of them, actually, because I probably haven't seen Lenny for, maybe sort of 25, 30 years myself. Yeah. So it was really amazing seeing it again.
Both good to see Lenny again. Good to see Reds for the first time. It seems like we've had a lot more to discuss about Reds, but I guess it's a lot bigger film.
It is, and kind of a lot going on there, and a big meaty subject, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Both actually really good films, and go and see them.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you watch Lenny? Because I don't have a copy of that one, so I just rented it on Apple TV.
I watched it on Amazon Prime.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so there you go, folks. So it's out there in streaming land as a rental, so go out and check it out. Yep. It's amazing. Yeah, it is. Really great film. Okay, well, folks, I think on that note, we're going to wrap it up for tonight. Jonathan, thanks for hanging out with me and talking about a couple of cool films tonight. Cool. And folks, thanks for joining in, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation and you'll go out and watch the films. Yes. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. We've got some really great plans over the next few episodes. We're lining up some really interesting guests. And we got some really cool films to talk about. We got all kinds of plans. And, of course, as always, watch out for our fabulous, funky film factoids. They'll be coming out every once in a while when we get enough time to actually put them together. So, we have fallen a little bit behind on those lately, but we'll be back. We'll get them out as and when we're able to. And until then, folks, we'll see you very soon. Definitely. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Bye for now.
Oh, the things these nerdy middle-aged men get up to.